Mara Voss had a secret that she carried the way some people carry old scars, quietly, carefully, and always slightly hidden beneath the surface. She was 28 years old, and for 15 of those years she had done one thing with more discipline than anything else in her life. She had kept her wolf buried. Not dead. She knew it was not dead. She could feel it sometimes, late at night, when the moon was full, and the forest beyond her cottage window seemed to breathe in a way that called to something deep inside her chest. On those nights, she would sit very still at her kitchen table, hands flat on the wood, and she would count her breaths until the feeling passed. 1, 2, 3, slow and deliberate, the way her grandmother had taught her. Her grandmother, Elena, had been a small woman with large, steady hands and eyes the color of creek water after rain. She had understood things that other people in the village did not understand, and she had loved Mara in the specific and practical way of a person who knows that love sometimes means protecting someone from the world rather than opening them up to it. If they see what you are, Elena had told 13-year-old Mara, the night after the first shift nearly tore through her, they will not try to understand it. They will only try to use it, or end it. Neither is something I am willing to allow. So Mara learned. She learned to breathe through the surges. She learned which herbs, steeped together in a specific order at a specific temperature, produced a tea that quieted the wolf the way a hand over a candle quiets a flame. She learned to walk slowly, to speak softly, to never let her eyes linger too long on anything that moved. She learned to take up very little space in any room she entered. By the time she was 20, she was so good at it that she almost forgot there was anything to hide. She moved to the mountain village of Bren after Elena died, inheriting the stone cottage and the recipe book and the small, ordered life that came with them. She took a job as a night shift nurse at the regional clinic. She kept a garden. She did not make close friends, not because she disliked people, but because close friends asked questions, and questions were the one thing Mara had no patience for. The people of Bren thought she was unusual, a little too quiet, a little too watchful, the kind of person who always seemed to know when a storm was coming before the sky gave any sign of it. They were not wrong about any of that, but they were also, she knew, nowhere near the truth of her. She was fine with that. She had been fine with that for a very long time. Then Callum Rain arrived, and things stopped being fine in a way that Mara could not immediately explain or easily defend against. He came on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves on the hillside had turned amber and the mornings carried the first real bite of the coming winter. He arrived with 2 other men in a dark car that was too clean for the unpaved roads of Bren, and he walked into the regional clinic without any of the uncertain energy that most visitors to a small mountain village carried with them. He walked as if he already owned the ground beneath him, but without arrogance. It was something quieter than arrogance. It was simply an absence of doubt. He needed a medical observer for a land boundary dispute, something about contested forest territory that required neutral documentation from a healthcare professional. She was handed the file and told to report to the meeting room. She did not look at him when she walked in. She did not need to. She felt the shift in the air the moment she crossed the threshold, a low and inexplicable pressure that moved through her chest and settled in the base of her spine like a stone dropping into still water. She attributed it to the heating system. The clinic's radiators were old and unreliable, and the air in that room was always slightly strange. She sat down. She opened her file. She did paperwork. She did not look up. He noticed, of course. Later she would understand that a man like Callum Rain noticed everything, that reading people, their posture, their breathing, the precise tension in the muscles across their shoulders, was as natural to him as reading words on a page. He noticed the way she held herself. He noticed the slight pause in her breathing when she first entered the room. He noticed that she was, with enormous and very deliberate effort, not looking at him. He said nothing. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, Mara gathered her papers, clipped her pen to the top of the folder, and stood up to leave. At the door, she had to pass within a few feet of where he was standing, talking in a low voice to one of the men who had come with him. She did not slow down. She kept her eyes forward. But just as she reached the doorway, she felt it, the wolf inside her, dormant and buried, and carefully controlled for 15 years, press against the inside of her ribs with a sudden and unmistakable force, not violently, not with urgency, more the way a person who has been asleep a very long time might turn over slowly in response to light. Mara did not stop walking. She kept moving, down the corridor, out through the side exit, into the cold morning air, and then she sat in her car for 4 minutes, with both hands pressed flat on the steering wheel, until the feeling passed. She drove home. She made the tea. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, and she counted her breaths, and she told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing, and some part of her already knew that. The land dispute extended. Callum did not leave. He appeared at the clinic twice more that week for additional documentation. He appeared at the village market on Saturday, buying coffee from the one small stall that sold it, and when Mara walked past with her basket, he looked up and met her eyes, in the simple, direct way of a person who has decided not to pretend they have not noticed another person. He said good morning. She said good morning. She kept walking. That evening her senses were sharper than they had been in years. She could hear the stream at the bottom of the hill from inside her cottage, which she had not been able to do since she was a teenager. The smell of the pine trees was so vivid it was almost overwhelming. She added more herbs to her tea, and sat up until nearly 3 in the morning, doing absolutely nothing, waiting for the heightened feeling to settle. It settled, but it did not leave entirely. Something in her had shifted, just slightly, the way a door shifts when the wood swells in damp weather, still closed, but no longer perfectly sealed. 3 weeks passed. Callum remained in Bren while the dispute worked its way through the necessary processes. Mara saw him, as the village was small, and there were only so many places a person could be. They did not talk beyond brief, functional exchanges. She told herself she was managing the situation well. Then one evening she was standing at the edge of the forest at dusk, which she did not normally allow herself, but the light had been so particular that evening, low and amber, and coming through the trees at an angle that made the whole hillside glow, that she had simply ended up there without fully deciding to. She was standing very still, watching the light change, when she became aware that someone else was standing nearby. She did not turn. She did not need to. They stood there together in silence for several minutes, both of them watching the forest, neither of them explaining why they were there. The silence was not uncomfortable. That was what unsettled her most. That standing beside this man she barely knew, in a silence that should have felt strange, felt instead like something close to rest. He left before dark. She stayed a few minutes longer, and then she walked home quickly and added extra herbs to the tin where she kept her supplies, because she was going to need them. The argument happened on a Wednesday. It was about a form, a standard medical documentation form, that Mara had declined to fill in until she had more specific information about the land parcel in question. It was a procedural matter, reasonable and professional, but the man from the county office who needed it was frustrated, and Callum was in the room, and the conversation became sharper than it needed to be. Mara held her position. She was accustomed to being the calmest person in any disagreement. She had made herself calm in the way that you make a garden, through years of consistent, deliberate tending. But somewhere in the middle of the argument, when the county official raised his voice, something in her shifted, without her permission, and her own voice dropped, low, and very clear, and carrying in it a certainty that had nothing to do with paperwork. The official stopped talking. The room was very quiet. She became aware, without looking, that Callum had gone still in a specific way. Not the stillness of a person who is surprised, but the stillness of a person who has just recognized something they were already looking for. "There you are," he said, very quietly. He was not talking to her. He was talking to something in her, and she knew it, and it moved through her like cold water. She picked up her file and walked out. That night, the suppressants failed for the first time in more than 10 years. Not fully, she did not shift, the wolf did not emerge, but she lost control of the suppression in a way that left her sitting on the cold floor of her cottage, with her back against the kitchen wall, overwhelmed by a feeling she had almost forgotten the shape of. It was not pain, it was not fear. It was recognition, the specific, disorienting feeling of something inside you that you have spent years calling dead, announcing, in no uncertain terms, that it is not. She cried for the first time in a very long while, not from grief, not from fear, but from the strange relief of feeling something she had buried, finally refusing to stay buried. She made her tea. She went to bed. She lay in the dark listening to the stream and the wind in the pines, and the distant sounds of the sleeping village, and she thought about her grandmother, who had taught her to hide herself so well that she had eventually become invisible even to her own heart. The dawn came early that Friday, cold and pale and arriving in thin strips of light through the gaps in her curtains. Mara had not slept. She dressed, and she did something she had not done in 15 years. She walked out of her cottage without putting the small bottle of herbal suppressant into her pocket. She walked to the edge of the forest. She stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, watching the sky slowly change color above the tree line, breathing the cold air that smelled of pine and frost and damp earth. She did not know what she was waiting for. She did not know if she was waiting for anything. She heard no footsteps. She simply became aware, the way you become aware of warmth when a door opens somewhere in a cold house, that she was no longer alone. He stood a few feet away. He did not speak. He did not position himself in front of her, or touch her, or make any movement that required her to respond. He simply stood beside her, the way he had stood beside her at dusk 3 weeks ago, present and quiet, and not performing anything. A long moment passed. Then he reached out, and the gesture was so simple that it almost did not register. He extended his hand and placed 2 fingers lightly on the inside of her wrist. Not a romantic gesture. Not a gesture with any intention she could object to. The touch of someone taking a pulse, careful, and brief, and very human. The wolf came up from 15 years of silence like a swimmer breaking the surface of water. It did not come violently. It did not come with force, or with fury. It rose the way something rises when the weight that was holding it down is finally, simply, lifted, with relief so complete that it was almost indistinguishable from grief. Mara did not shift. She stood perfectly still, her coat open, her hands at her sides, while every part of her interior rewrote itself in the space of a few seconds. The wolf rose. It breathed. It recognized the morning air, and the tree line, and the pale cold sky, and it exhaled. And the sound that came out of Mara was the most honest sound she had made since she was 13 years old. Callum removed his hand. He did not speak for a long time. The sky above the pines went from gray to pale gold, slowly and without drama, the way mornings arrive in places that have not been disturbed by too much human noise. "You have been carrying that alone," he said finally. His voice was not gentle in the way that people are gentle when they pity someone. It was the voice of a person stating something true, and leaving space around the truth for the other person to inhabit it without being crowded. 15 years, Mara answered. The words were very small. They did not contain everything. They could not contain everything. 15 years was not a thing you could put into 2 words, or 20 words, or probably any number of words at all. But it was what she had, and she said it. And he did not try to respond with anything that would make it smaller. They stood there for a while longer, and then the sun came fully over the ridge, and the light fell warm and real, and entirely ordinary, on the frost-covered ground. Mara took 1 step forward, into the trees, and then another. She did not shift. She was not ready for that, and she understood, with a clarity she had not expected, that readiness was not something that would happen in a single morning. 15 years had made their mark in her body, and her habits, and her understanding of herself, and those marks did not dissolve because a wolf had risen, and a stranger had placed 2 careful fingers on the inside of her wrist at dawn. There would be months ahead. There would be difficulty. There would be the long and patient work of learning to live with something she had spent half her life trying to contain. But she walked. She walked between the tall pines, and the wolf walked with her, no longer below her, or behind her, or pressed against her ribs in a demand she could not answer. They moved together, in the same direction, for the first time since she was 13 years old. She did not look back. She did not need to. She was, for the first time in 15 years, simply walking forward, fully present, fully real, and no longer alone in her own skin.